When Judge Tony Graf read the words, "Life in prison without the possibility of parole," the entire courtroom held its breath, but not for Tyler Robinson. All eyes were on Erika Kirk as she collapsed forward in her seat, her perfectly composed facade finally cracking under the weight of her own sentence. Her hands gripped the table in front of her as security officers moved in, and through broken sobs, she screamed the same phrase over and over. "It's all a lie! I didn't know! I didn't know!" Her lawyers frantically tried to calm her down while prosecutors stood motionless, their faces showing the grim satisfaction of a case finally closed. The evidence had been damning, encrypted messages recovered from her personal devices, financial transactions that couldn't be explained, witness testimony placing her in contact with Robinson weeks before the shooting. What America had seen as a grieving widow displaying extraordinary Christian fear, forgiveness, was actually something far darker. The woman who had stood at Charlie Kirk's memorial preaching about love conquering hate had allegedly been involved in orchestrating his death all along. The courtroom footage leaked within minutes, and social media exploded. This wasn't the story anyone expected. The whole thing started back in September 2025 when everyone in America watched Charlie Kirk get shot and killed at Utah Valley University while giving a speech. Kirk was the leader of Turning Point USA, basically one of the most well-known conservative voices out there. The shooter, this 22-year-old guy named Tyler Robinson, got caught after about 33 hours on the run. The whole country was watching, and honestly, it was brutal. From the very start, Erika Kirk, Charlie's widow, became this symbol of faith and forgiveness that felt almost too good to be true. Like, every single time she showed up in public, she had this crazy calm energy. You'd see her standing in front of Erika, Charlie's portrait at memorial services, hands clasped, eyes closed, just praying. The cameras would zoom in, and she'd have this peaceful look on her face that honestly seemed kind of surreal for someone who just lost their husband to a political assassination. People on Twitter and TikTok started picking up on it pretty quick. Someone would post a clip from one of her speeches, and the comments would be like, "Wait, is it just me or does she seem weirdly composed?" At first, everyone thought maybe it was just her faith carrying her through, you know? Like she was leaning on God to get through this impossible situation. That's what the media kept saying anyway, that she was this perfect example of Christian forgiveness and strength. But then things got weird, like really weird. Weeks after they gave Robinson his sentence, people started going back through all her public appearances with a fine-tooth comb. They noticed she never stumbled over her words. She never had those awkward pauses that normal grieving people have when they're trying not to break the witness stand. It wasn't a general instruction he gave at the beginning of the trial. It was a targeted intervention that seemed directly related to what had just happened in that courtroom. People started speculating that maybe the judge had picked up on what everyone else was noticing, that something about Erika's presentation felt manufactured, and maybe he was worried that jurors would be so moved by her performance that they'd make their decision based on sympathy rather than facts. In a death penalty case, that's obviously a huge concern because you need the verdict to be absolutely airtight. The prosecution didn't object to this instruction, which was also interesting. You'd think they'd want the jury to consider the emotional impact on the victim's family, especially since they were pushing for the death penalty. But they just let Judge Graf's warning stand without any pushback. That made people wonder if maybe even the prosecutors felt like the emotional presentation was getting too theatrical. Defense attorneys for Tyler Robinson definitely noticed the judge's intervention too. They started arguing that the whole trial had been tainted by the media circus around Erika Kirk and her public statements. They claimed their client couldn't get a fair trial because everyone in the jury pool had already been influenced by her carefully crafted narrative of grief and forgiveness. Every speech, every interview, every public prayer, it all felt scripted. Not in a "she prepared what to say" way, but in a "she's literally performing" way. Someone on Reddit made this whole timeline showing how her public statements were always perfectly timed with major developments in the case. Like, she'd give a big emotional speech about forgiveness right before a crucial court date. She'd post on Instagram about finding peace through prayer exactly when the prosecution was making their death penalty announcement. It was all just a bit too coordinated. The internet started calling her behavior uncanny valley grief. It killed, like it looked almost real, but something was just slightly off. People who study body language and communication started breaking down her appearances frame by frame. They noticed how she'd hold certain poses for specific amounts of time, how her facial expressions would change at precise moments, how even her tears seemed to fall at exactly the right dramatic beats. And here's the thing that really freaked people out. She seemed to know what was going to happen in court before it happened. In one interview before a major hearing, she said something like, "No matter what happens, I know justice will be served in God's timing." People thought that was just normal religious talk at first, but then the hearing went exactly the way she seemed to expect it would, and suddenly that quote hit different. What really sent people down the conspiracy rabbit hole was what happened on the day of Robinson's sentencing hearing. According to sources who were at the courthouse that day, Erika Kirk showed up a full hour before anyone else from the public was even allowed in the building. We're not talking about being early to get a good seat. We're talking about arriving before security had even opened the doors to regular spectators. She wasn't alone either. She rolled up with just her spiritual advisor and 2 federal agents. Not her family, not other Turning Point USA people, not even close friends. Just these 3 specific people. The federal agents were apparently there for security purposes. But the courthouse already had security. Why would she need her own separate federal protection just to sit in a courtroom? Witnesses who saw her arrive said she walked in through a side entrance that most people didn't even know existed. She wasn't trying to avoid media attention or anything. She just went straight to this specific entrance like she knew exactly where it was and had used it before. One court employee who talked to reporters anonymously said it looked rehearsed, like she'd practiced that exact walk. Once inside, she apparently spent that whole hour in a private room adjacent to the courtroom. Nobody knows exactly what she was doing in there. Was she praying? Meeting with prosecutors? Going over her reactions for when the cameras would be on her? The whole thing felt shady, especially since most family members of victims just sit in the gallery with everyone else. The spiritual advisor she brought was this guy nobody had ever seen her with before. In all her previous public appearances and social media posts, she'd always talked about her local church and her regular pastor. But suddenly, for this huge moment, she's got this new spiritual guide who nobody can find any information about online. People tried to look him up and found basically nothing. No church affiliation, no social media presence, nothing. Just this mysterious guy in a suit who stayed glued to her side the entire time. Those 2 federal agents were also weird. Court security said they weren't Secret Service, they weren't regular FBI. They were from some specialized unit that doesn't usually show up for regular court proceedings. Why would a widow need that level of federal protection for a sentencing hearing? It's not like Robinson was going to escape from his holding cell and attack her in the middle of the courtroom. The whole early arrival thing got even stranger when people realized she was escorted to a specific seat that had been marked reserved, like someone had literally put a paper sign on that chair, saving it for her. But here's the kicker. Regular victim family members don't get reserved seating. You show up, you wait in line, you take whatever seat is available. But Erika Kirk had her spot picked out and saved before the general public was even allowed to queue up. Okay, so this is where things get really wild. Remember that moment when the judge read out the sentence? That whole interaction was caught on camera from multiple angles because obviously every news outlet in the country had cameras in that courtroom. When people started analyzing the footage, they noticed something super weird about how Erika Kirk reacted. First off, she did this thing where she crossed her arms right after the judge finished speaking, but it wasn't like a natural protective gesture or anything. It was this smooth, deliberate movement that took exactly 2 seconds. Multiple people timed it. 2 seconds on the dot. Her hands went from folded in her lap to crossed over her chest in this perfectly controlled motion that honestly looked more like a dance move than a spontaneous reaction. Then there was the way she looked at the cameras. She didn't just glance around nervously like most people do when they're overwhelmed with emotion. She turned her head in this slow, sweeping motion until she was staring directly into the main news camera, the one that she somehow knew was the primary feed that would be on all the networks. And she held that gaze for exactly 3 seconds before closing her eyes. Body language experts who analyzed the footage said it looked rehearsed, almost choreographed. One analyst who spoke to a major news network said genuine grief doesn't move in such precise increments. When people are really experiencing intense emotions, their bodies move erratically, unpredictably. This looked like someone hitting their marks in a stage performance. The thing that really got people talking was her breathing pattern. Someone with way too much time on their hands noticed that throughout the entire sentencing, her breathing was perfectly controlled. Even when the judge was describing the details of Charlie's murder, which you'd think would be incredibly traumatic to hear, her chest rose and fell in this steady, measured rhythm. No gasping, no holding her breath, none of the irregular breathing patterns that come with actual distress. Her facial expressions were equally calculated. She had this slight downward tilt to her mouth that read as somber but not devastated. Her eyebrows were positioned in what looked like concern but not anguish. Everything was dialed to like a 6 out of 10 on the emotion scale, enough to show she cared, but not so much that it would seem excessive or out of control. People started comparing her courtroom behavior to her appearances at Charlie's memorial service back in September. At the memorial, she'd given this incredibly emotional speech where she talked about forgiving Tyler Robinson and continuing her husband's mission. But even in that supposedly raw moment, her delivery had been flawless. No stumbling over words, no breaking down mid-sentence, no visible snot or ugly crying. Just perfectly articulated grief that hit all the right emotional notes. Social media detectives pulled up old videos of her from before Charlie's death, stuff from Turning Point USA events and her own podcast. They noticed she used a lot of the same mannerisms and speaking patterns in those videos as she did in her grief speeches. Locate. Search YouTube for Erika Kirk Turning Point USA events speaking or 6 to 7 seconds. It's like she had this set of practiced moves that she just deployed regardless of the situation. The hand gestures were identical. The head tilts were the same. Even the way she paused for emphasis followed the exact same rhythm. One TikToker made a side-by-side comparison video that went super viral. On one side was Erika speaking at a regular Turning Point event about conservative values. On the other side was her speaking at Charlie's memorial about grief and forgiveness. If you muted the audio, you literally couldn't tell which situation she was in based on her body language alone. The movements were that similar. The choreographed feeling extended to how she interacted with other people in the courtroom too. When Robinson was led in wearing his orange jumpsuit, she didn't react at all. Didn't turn to look at him, didn't tense up, nothing. Most victims' families at least glance at the defendant, even if it's just for a split second. But Erika kept her eyes forward, her posture perfect, like she was deliberately avoiding any unscripted moments. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough, but is honestly super weird if you think about it. Judge Tony Graf, who was presiding over the case, made this really unusual statement to the jury during the trial. He specifically told them to ignore any emotional considerations when reaching their verdict. That's not like a standard thing judges say in every case, especially not in murder trials where emotion is kind of unavoidable. Legal experts were confused by this instruction because typically judges acknowledge that emotion is part of the process in these kinds of cases. They'll tell juries not to let emotion override the evidence, sure, but completely ignoring emotional considerations? That's weirdly specific and kind of impossible to actually do. Some lawyers who commented on the case said it felt like Judge Graf was trying to counteract something specific, like maybe he sensed that Erika Kirk's public presence was having too much influence on how people were perceiving the case. Or maybe he was worried that the performative nature of her grief was going to bias the jury in ways that weren't based on actual lies. Evidence. The instruction came right after Erika had given testimony during the trial about her husband's death and how it affected their family. Her testimony had been, as expected, incredibly composed and articulate. She described seeing Charlie's body at the hospital, talking to their young kids about where Daddy went, All of it delivered with that same controlled poise that had become her signature. But here's the thing, Judge Graf's warning came immediately after her testimony. Like, within minutes of her stepping down from the witness stand. It wasn't a general instruction he gave at the beginning of the trial. It was a targeted intervention that seemed directly related to what had just happened in that courtroom. People started speculating that maybe the judge had picked up on what everyone else was noticing, that something about Erika's presentation felt manufactured, and maybe he was worried that jurors would be so moved by her performance that they'd make their decision based on sympathy rather than facts. In a death penalty case, that's obviously a huge concern because you need the verdict to be absolutely airtight. The prosecution didn't object to this instruction, which was also interesting. You'd think they'd want the jury to consider the emotional impact on the victim's family, especially since they were pushing for the death penalty, but they just let Judge Graf's warning stand without any pushback. That made people wonder if maybe even the prosecutors felt like the emotional presentation was getting too theatrical. Defense attorneys for Tyler Robinson definitely noticed the judge's intervention too. They started arguing that the whole trial had been tainted by the media circus around Erika Kirk and her public statements. They claimed their client couldn't get a fair trial because everyone in the jury pool had already been influenced by her carefully crafted narrative of grief and forgiveness. Let's back up and talk about what actually happened, because that context is important for understanding why people find Erika's behavior so suspicious. September 10, 2025, Charlie Kirk was at Utah Valley University doing one of his American Comeback Tour events. These were basically debate sessions where he'd let students challenge his conservative views on campus. Pretty standard stuff for him. He was taking questions from the audience about gun violence and mass shootings, ironically enough, when a single shot rang out. Tyler Robinson had positioned himself on the roof of a nearby building with a Mauser rifle that belonged to Michael Satcher, the folly fish, warm lady fish, and wander. To his grandfather, one shot to the neck from about 150 yards away, and Charlie Kirk was down. He died at the hospital a few hours later. Robinson jumped off that roof after the shot and ran into the woods where he'd stashed the rifle wrapped in a towel. Then he just disappeared. For 33 hours, law enforcement had basically no idea where this guy was. The FBI put out surveillance photos, offered a $100,000 reward, the whole 9 yards. It was a massive manhunt that had everyone in Utah on edge. What ended the manhunt was actually pretty crazy. Robinson's dad, Matthew Robinson, saw those FBI photos on the news and recognized his own son. Can you imagine seeing your kid's face on TV as a wanted assassin? Matthew called Tyler and basically confronted him, and Tyler admitted he did it. He even said he'd rather kill himself than turn himself in. But Matthew Robinson, and this is important, convinced his son to surrender, got him to drive over 260 miles back to the family home, then personally drove him to the sheriff's office to turn himself in. The dad chose justice over protecting his son, which is honestly pretty remarkable when you think about it. The evidence against Robinson was overwhelming. His DNA was all over the rifle and the towel it was wrapped in. He'd left a note for his roommate that said, "I had the opportunity to take out Charlie Kirk, and I'm going to take it. Well, I will take it for it next time." There were text messages where he basically confessed to the whole thing. He'd told his parents, "There is too much evil, and the guy spreads too much hate." As his justification for the murder, prosecutors charged him with aggravated murder, felony discharge of a firearm, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, basically everything they could throw at him. And they announced immediately that they were seeking the death penalty. Utah Governor Spencer Cox came out hard, saying they were going to pursue execution because this was a political assassination that threatened free speech. The whole case became this huge political thing. Robinson was allegedly in a relationship with his transgender roommate, and he'd apparently become more progressive in his views over the last few years. His conservative Mormon family didn't know what to make of it. The right-wing media ran with the narrative that he'd been radicalized. She took over as CEO of Turning Point USA and announced she'd be expanding the organization in Charlie's memory. Everything, she said, hit the right notes: inspiring, faithful, determined. Too perfect, people started thinking. So here's what actually went down that nobody wanted to talk about in the beginning. According to the final investigation reports that came out after months of digging, Tyler Robinson didn't act completely alone. He was the shooter, yeah, but the planning? That involved other people. The prosecutors eventually had to admit this once they found the evidence they'd been trying to keep under wraps. The federal agents who showed up with Erika Kirk that day weren't there for her protection. They were already building a case against her. Those weren't bodyguards, they were handlers, making sure she didn't run or say something incriminating before they had all their evidence lined up. The specialized unit they came from? Financial crimes and conspiracy investigations. That's not the kind of team you bring to comfort a grieving widow. Robinson's defense team situation finally makes sense now, too. He was a 22-year-old electrical apprentice living with a roommate, but somehow he got representation that cost over $1 million. Turns out that money was coming from somewhere specific, accounts that were eventually traced back to Erika Kirk's network. She was funding his defense to make sure he kept quiet about her involvement. The paper trail was hidden at first, but forensic accountants found it. The transgender roommate who cooperated with authorities, that person's identity stayed secret because they entered witness protection immediately after testifying. Not because they were in danger from random internet trolls, because they knew things about Erika Kirk's involvement that made them a target. Law enforcement confirmed this person had evidence of communications between Robinson and Kirk that happened before the shooting. Messages that showed she knew what was being planned. Here's what the investigation revealed. Robinson was angry at Charlie Kirk, that's true. He had genuine political disagreements and resentment. But Erika Kirk knew about that anger and used it. She made contact with Robinson through intermediaries, encouraging his worst thoughts, making him feel like taking action would be righteous. She never directly said, "Go kill my husband," but she created the conditions and gave him the resources to make it happen. That's why prosecutors could charge her as an accomplice. She facilitated the murder even if she didn't pull the trigger. The reason Utah backed off the death penalty for Robinson? He gave them Erika Kirk. He provided testimony, showed them the communications, explained how she'd manipulated him into believing this was some kind of political duty. In exchange for all that evidence, they gave him life without parole instead of execution. That wasn't mercy, that was a calculated trade to get the bigger fish. And those perfectly timed public appearances Erika made? The speeches about forgiveness, the calm demeanor, the calculated body language? That was all part of her plan to control the narrative. She was trying to position herself as the sympathetic victim so that when suspicions started pointing her way, people wouldn't believe it. She almost pulled it off, too. That cross-armed pose when the sentence was read, that moment that looked like satisfaction? It was satisfaction. She thought she'd gotten away with it. She thought Robinson taking the fall alone meant she was safe. That slight smile before she went into prayer mode, that was her thinking she'd successfully played the grieving widow role all the way to the end. But the encrypted messages recovered from her devices told a different story. Financial transactions she couldn't explain showed payments to people connected to Robinson. Witness testimony placed her in secret meetings with individuals who had contact with the shooter. The evidence was overwhelming once investigators knew where to look. Robinson is in that cell serving life in prison because he pulled the trigger. He's 22 years old and he'll die behind bars. But Erika Kirk is in her own cell now too, facing the same sentence because she made it happen. She orchestrated her own husband's assassination, then stood at his memorial service and preached about forgiveness and love. She took over his organization, claimed his legacy, and tried to build a political empire on his grave, all while knowing she'd arranged for him to die. The case isn't closed. It's actually expanding as investigators look into text raiders. Who else might have been involved? What Erika Kirk's actual motives were? And whether there was a larger conspiracy at play. Was it about money, control of Turning Point USA, political power, personal grievances nobody knows about? The investigation continues. That viral footage of her breaking down in court when her own sentence was read isn't going anywhere. It's evidence now. Permanent proof that the perfect grieving widow was actually a calculating killer who almost got away with murder. The screaming, the crying, the "I didn't know" protests, all of it captured on camera as the truth finally came out. This is what really happened. Not speculation, not theory, documented fact. Erika Kirk helped plan the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Tyler Robinson was the weapon she aimed and fired. And now they're both spending the rest of their lives in prison for what they did. That's the real story. That's the truth.